So our reading this morning is actually a video, and it is quite a bit longer than I would normally choose to show on a Sunday morning, but it's so clearly stated that I was like, we just need to watch the whole thing. So I'm just gonna give you a little bit of information to contextualize it. It is a shortish TED Talk by Shannon Sleva, who's an associate professor at the University of Denver at the School of Social Work. And it describes an aspect of what we call restorative justice practices. What I'd like you to know before we start the video is that restorative justice practices have their roots in indigenous communities, and they involve intentional, careful, and structured dialogue. They're intended to grow community as well as provide a way back into community when there's been some sort of break or transgression.
I'd like you to recall a time when you were really hurt by another person. Maybe physically, maybe they lied to you or broke your trust. Maybe they stole something from you or put their interest ahead of yours. In that moment, and the weeks and the months following, what was it that you really wanted? What would have actually made you feel better? So in years of asking this question to my students, to justice professionals in courtrooms and prisons, and to victims of crime, a handful of people have told me, honestly, it would have made me feel better to key their car. But not many. Actually, nearly all of us want the same thing. You want them to look you in the eye, acknowledge what happened, and maybe, if it's genuine, apologize. And you want a chance to explain how they've impacted your life and see them really get it. You want answers to some questions so you can stop trying to figure out how this happened, how you could have protected yourself better, and whether you can trust someone again. It's important to know that these are not things our justice system offers crime victims. In fact, there are all sorts of real and symbolic barriers that prevent people who cause harm from being accountable to the people they hurt. The first thing they hear is, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be held against you in a court of law. In other words, don't apologize and don't take accountability because you might jeopardize your legal case. For crime victims, the most consistent ways to participate in the justice process are a private consultation with the DA or reading a statement during sentencing. You may have no interaction with the offender whatsoever. They may not even be allowed to make eye contact with you in the courtroom. In most states, incarcerated people aren't allowed contact with victims and their family members, even if they both request it. So maybe we could accept some of these failures if our justice system worked in other ways. And by worked, I mean kept people on the outside safe and changed people on the inside for the better. But our justice system utterly fails everyone it touches. Not a surprise, right? In prison, people get hurt instead of helped. And no matter how strict we get, no matter how much control that we exert, 50 to 70% of people who leave prison are back within 3 years. The communities most with the highest rates of incarceration, poor communities of color, actually have more stress, trauma, and mental illness. I could go on and on. But instead, I want to talk to you about restorative justice, a surprising approach that might offer better outcomes for victims, offenders, and the communities they live in. And I want to suggest that in order for it to work, we all have to do our part. Now, restorative justice is not a new idea. Some people say it's the most common approach to justice across the world and throughout time, but that somewhere along the way, we forgot how to do it. It's a philosophy that says getting justice means repairing harm. And in restorative justice, repairing harm happens through face-to-face dialogues between the people harmed and the people responsible. For instance, here in Colorado, hundreds of cases are diverted from the courts each year through restorative conferences that bring together victims, offenders, and affected community members to agree on how to repair harms after a property crime or an assault. For example, someone who vandalized a local business might agree to repaint the wall themselves. Someone who caused a car accident might agree to pay the victim's medical bills. And sometimes agreements are symbolic, like writing a letter of apology, doing a service project, or volunteering with the victim's favorite charity. But the goal of these agreements and the whole process is always to meet the needs that were created by the crime and to facilitate direct accountability. I am not saying that restorative justice is the answer to every criminal case or all the complex problems with the criminal justice system. And I want to be clear that victims should always have a choice about if and when they meet someone that harmed them. But what I am saying is that this is a transformative approach that can be used far more often than we may believe. And studies of Colorado's diversion programs show that 95% of both victims and offenders are satisfied with the process, and that offenders have a recidivism rate of just 8%. So this is a select group of cases, but it's also an enormous difference. And this is what a system designed to keep people safe should be doing: healing victims and preventing harm. So if restorative justice works so well, why isn't it the basis for our current justice system? It's a great question. And it's why I started out my career studying why some states were adopting restorative justice into their state codes and others weren't. And I was actually surprised to find that most states have adopted legislation that supports the use of restorative justice in criminal cases, but that these policies are rarely put into practice by prosecutors, judges, and correctional officials. What I learned when I talked with these potential change agents is that they were either skeptical about restorative justice or they just didn't understand how it fit in their roles. In other words, they either don't wanna or they don't know how. See, restorative justice, face-to-face dialogue about crime, conflict, pain, suffering, it's incredibly difficult, not just for justice professionals, for all of us. I teach a class on restorative justice, and my first reaction to conflict is to hide in my office and avoid eye contact with my email account. I once engineered an elaborate game of phone tag that went on for weeks just by, calling at the time when you knew the person wouldn't pick up, just to avoid a difficult conversation. These are silly little examples of our very serious impulse to hide from the people and the situations that cause us pain. My theory is that isolation is our default response to crime because it's actually our default response to conflict. We block, we ghost, we cancel the people who hurt us, and we overuse prison not because we actually think it makes things better, but because we're afraid of being hurt and we don't know what else to do. We want accountability, but we don't want to have the hard conversations that it requires. We'd rather believe there's a simple solution that can keep us safe and protect us from pain. It's easy to feel that mass incarceration is something done to us by politicians, police, prosecutors, and prison guards. But it's important to remember that it's something we invest in each time we build virtual and physical walls between ourselves and others. As a result of our inability to face those we hurt and those who hurt us, we participate, knowingly or unknowingly, in systems of control and isolation. Our policy problem is a people problem. The good news is, restorative justice offers a people solution. It teaches us that what changes our choices is actually not laws. Otherwise, the drug war would be all wrapped up, right? It's actually coming face to face, realizing that we've hurt someone and being willing to make amends. And similarly, if we want to change the criminal justice system, we have to face each other, take responsibility for our roles in mass incarceration, and do what we can to repair the harm. That's why innovative prosecutors, yes, they exist, creative correctional administrators, committed legislators, even researchers like me, are increasingly coming together to have these hard conversations. We're listening to the people who are most impacted: incarcerated people, their families, crime victims, and survivors. And we're designing solutions together that we can all agree on. My experience with restorative justice tells me that the solutions we forge together are far more powerful than the ones we hand down from the safety of our courtrooms and our offices. And I believe this is a restorative movement that can transform the way we think about doing justice. But it will take more than those of us working in the justice system to transform it. It will actually take all of us, because real criminal justice reform will never happen until we face our fear of facing each other. And it's a really hard thing to do, but I know we can do it because I see incredible, courageous examples in my work all the time. Not long ago, I sat at a little round table in the prison visiting area with the wife and the daughter of a man killed in a robbery and the person serving life without parole for his murder. The victim's family brought this little hardbound notebook filled with all their unanswered questions, all the things they wanted to tell this man about their lives and what they had lost. And I watched as they led this beautiful, really heartbreaking, but empowering dialogue. And for 6 hours, I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. Yes, because we had prepared for this moment for months, but mostly because they had the wisdom. The innate human wisdom to say what needs to be said and to do what needs to be done to further our own healing and that of our communities. And you have that wisdom too. We all have the wisdom and the skill and the compassion to restore ourselves to ourselves, not through isolation, but through connection. Thank you.
She basically just gave a sermon. I mean, yesterday, more than a dozen folks in positions of leadership here in the congregation participated in a small workshop on restorative justice. We learned about its origins. We did a little practice. You'll get to practice after service today. And I just want to share a little bit. Restorative justice, we learned yesterday from our workshop leaders, has its roots in Indigenous culture and practice. This practice of coming together to consider harm and to dialogue with one another face to face was introduced into sort of the Canadian and American culture decades ago in an attempt to help prevent the mass incarceration of Indigenous people that's been going on for a century or more. Knowledge about restorative justice practices and principles were offered by Indigenous people to their oppressors in the hopes that this tool might save the lives of Indigenous people, right? We live and we work in a system and a culture that metes out punitive justice. That's our orientation around crime and transgression, meaning the order of the day is punishment, right? It's in an effort to deter by making jail so unappealing that no one wants to go or go back. It's in an effort to prevent by locking people up so they can't commit crimes again. Now, I want to say very clearly, just as she did in our video, I believe in consequences for actions, right? Sometimes those consequences do involve separation from society in order to maintain safety, okay? So no one, some people are saying it, I'm not saying open all the prisons and let everyone out, right? Just like, let's start from that assumption together that that is not what we're talking about. But what I am saying is that we do have a problem, and she spoke of it, and I'm gonna give you a little more detail, right? So, it is true that our current jail system in the United States imprisons more people per capita than any other developed country in the world. We're like number 6 behind like Rwanda and a couple of other places. We imprison more people in raw numbers and per capita than Russia or China. The NAACP reports that the US has about 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prison population. Data from the American Action Forum and elsewhere also tells us that something like 1/2 of our prison population are folks whose crimes were nonviolent, either drug-related or debt-related imprisonment. There are more people currently in jail in this country for drug offenses than there are in jail in the entirety of the EU for any offenses at all. So let that sink in for a minute. The ACLU offers additional information, which is useful to know. We spend $80 billion, give or take a year, to imprison our prison population. And the spending on prisons has increased at 3 times the rate of increase is 3 times higher than the rate of increase in our investment in education. Is that, okay. We also know that we disproportionately imprison people of color. Black folks, in spite of having approximately the same drug use rate, are imprisoned at 10 times the rate of whites for drug crimes. Sentences are routinely harsher for people of color. The NAACP reports that if our system jailed Black folks and Hispanic folks at the same rate and sentencing as whites, the prison and jail population would decline by nearly 40%. We disproportionately imprison the poor. Many of our currently imprisoned folks are there because they could not pay fines or have in some other way become indebted. And we've spoken here in the past about the school to prison pipeline that is fed by schools that are under-resourced. See that previous rate increase on education. Children who are suspended and expelled become more likely to end up in the prison system with stops along the way at juvenile detention centers or alternative disciplinary schools. We have a punishment problem, and it is a huge financial burden on our country, but also a huge moral burden. It's important to state very clearly that the crime rate statistics do not map one-to-one onto the statistics for imprisonment, meaning we don't imprison more people and for a longer period of time because we have more or worse crime. Countries with comparable crime rates imprison far fewer people. We imprison more people because our system is punitive, not restorative. Our current system of punitive justice is applied unevenly, unjustly, and the statistics, when you read them and you hear them, are actually quite painful. It is also true that our prisons are often terribly unsafe and encourage more, criminal or antisocial behavior. The conditions often barely humane, and our attempts at rehabilitation fall short. Our current system doesn't do what it's supposed to do or what it claims to do. It doesn't deter, it doesn't prevent long-term, and only rarely does it achieve real change. Recidivism, so the return to crime by someone who has committed it once, estimates put the recidivism in this country at somewhere between 60% and 80%. So 60 to 80% of folks who go to prison will commit a crime again. The system doesn't work, but we cling to it and we expand it, and it is ever growing, ever growing. So why? Why is the system what it is? And why do we keep moving forward with it? And Dr. Sliva offers some ideas, right? Our approach to conflict. And I think there are likely many reasons. I think among them are that we aren't sure what a viable alternative is, right? We also have in this country a long inheritance of violence and separation, dividing ourselves from each other. And I also would suggest to you that bound up in our reluctance to look for an alternative is the fear that she offers, our ongoing sense of scarcity in this country, the way that power and money operate. You can look at how privatization of prisons has been pushed for. And also a misguided sense of progress as something linear and unending, and we're marching forward, and either you're along for that ride or you're not. I also think that one of the reasons we continue to use this rabidly punitive system is that our shared American culture does not have a sense of the world as whole, or our place as in relationship with each other. We have a deep sense of individuality, a deep sense of separation, not a deep sense of connection and community. And so the principles of restorative justice are the ones that defy that, right? They're the principles of community and connection, restoration, return. These practices, these dialogue circles, are grounded in the belief that all people should have a voice and that telling our story matters, and also in the belief that people can change and behaviors improve, and that it helps all of us to come back together after a transgression and reaffirm our shared humanity. Again, the suggestion is not to let crime run rampant or let all the prisons shut down. But inherent in the suggestion of a turn toward restorative justice is, I think, a complete reorientation in how we understand our shared existence on this planet. Instead of looking at each other as other, instead of maintaining lines of separation and distance, an orientation towards restorative practices asks us to see our shared humanity, to understand our participation in the human community. And so in an ideal world, restorative justice practices and dialogue circles are part of an overhaul of all things, aligning our society and our behaviors to a renewed sense of connection and interdependence. So as a result, we would invest more in education, particularly daycare and early childhood education, as a way to ensure that empathy is cultivated along with a community-oriented compassion. As I was reading and looking at stuff for this Sunday, I came across Dan Reisel, who's a neuroscientist who has studied the brains of hardened violent criminals in the UK. And he reminds us through his work with them that the brain is pliable, trainable, and the earliest stages of development are critical for building the neural pathways of empathy and compassion. They're made by going over and over, right? Neural pathways are strengthened by repetition, return, again and again, reinforcing certain behaviors and certain beliefs. We would also invest more in caring for those among us who struggle with mental illness, so that prison isn't seemingly our only way to deal with those in pain. We would ensure their access to care and housing and medicine as they work on their healing. We'd provide easy access for everyone to healthcare, so that medical debt doesn't destroy lives, resulting in homelessness and poverty. We would ensure housing and food for all people, so that the petty crimes of desperation didn't result in months or years of imprisonment. We would work together consciously and committedly on anti-racism, making anti-racism a bedrock learning for the children of this country, so that the insidious oppression of unjust punishment ends. And I'm not naive. I understand that shifting an entire culture and making changes like this is hard. It takes work. Sometimes we don't want to do it. But I, in my heart of hearts, actually believe that these are achievable goals, if we want them to be. Just because something is hard, we don't throw up our hands and give up, right? We can actually begin to build a country we feel proud of, but it requires us to think differently about the world and our place in it and what it asks of us. This restorative orientation has the power to shift how we relate to one another, how we see our place in time and space, how we understand our own deepest needs to belong and to be seen. So whether you're skeptical or absolutely taken with the idea, stay for the workshop. My last plug. It's my last plug. I want to share one small story. When my oldest child was young, the school that we were in handled disruptive behavior or issues among the students in a punitive way. Kids got sent out of the room to sit in the hallway, or they got sent to the principal, or they were made to stay back from recess if they were an offender. It was a punitive system, and separation was the key. We moved our child to a progressive school. One of the first stories I heard was essentially about a restorative justice circle. Someone had tripped someone in the stairwell and a coat was thrown and everyone was late to class. It was like very dramatic. It's third graders, right? And I asked my kid what happened. What did the teachers do? And the answer was we sat down in a circle. People shared about their experience of the incident. Kids acknowledged what they'd done wrong, or if they'd lied about it, they came clean. There were apologies, and we got back to learning. It was, without the name, a dialogue circle designed to strengthen the community and move it forward, and I was delighted. This was not removal, this was not punishment, this was not fleeing conflict and separating and isolating, which is all too often how we are taught to handle these things. This was a group of 9 and 10-year-olds learning what it means to stay at the table, to discuss, to take accountability for their actions, and to move forward together. We are not separate from one another. This is a fundamental belief that we share in Unitarian Universalism. We believe in our interdependence, that we are responsible for one another, for making each other's lives better, for doing what we can to change the system that oppresses and confines and separates. We believe that we are responsible for doing the work that brings us all into a time of larger community, deeper relationship, greater accountability, and forgiveness.